Dawn crept across the frontier the way it always did, slow, pale, and indifferent. The sky was washed thin with gray, and the land lay quiet except for the wind brushing through dry grass and the creak of a half-rotted fence along the road. Near a watering trough that hadn't seen a full bucket in weeks, a man lay sprawled in the dirt, coat torn, face bruised, boots cracked from long miles. He hadn't fallen neatly. He'd collapsed, like the land itself had finally decided he'd gone far enough. A few townsfolk found him first. They gathered at a distance, boots planted, hands tucked into coats. Someone muttered that he was probably drunk. Someone else said drifters always end up like this. No name was spoken, no question asked. To them, he was just another body passing through, a nobody with no claim, no kin, no reason to matter once the sun climbed higher. They didn't notice how still he was, didn't notice the way his breathing stayed slow and controlled, even in pain, didn't notice that his hand, resting near the dust, was steady, calm, as if he'd chosen the spot, rather than been beaten into it. That was when the rancher arrived. He reined in his horse a short distance away, watching the small knot of people, listening without speaking. He was a quiet man, the kind who learned early not to waste words. He took in the drifter's condition with one long look, the cuts, the blood dried dark along the collar, the way the man's coat, though torn, had once been good quality. Not town good. Better. Someone ought to do something. A voice said. No one's stopping you. Another answered. But they all stepped back when the rancher moved forward. He crouched beside the drifter, close enough now to see the man's eyes flicker open. Clear eyes. Focused. Not lost. The drifter met the rancher's gaze without fear, without pleading. Just acknowledgement. Like two men taking measure of each other in silence. The rancher hesitated. Leaving him would be easier. Safer. That was how the frontier taught its lessons. Then he reached out. As he lifted the drifter, the man didn't groan, didn't cling. He adjusted his weight, helping himself onto the saddle with practiced efficiency. That was the moment, the quiet contradiction. A body broken, yes, but a presence that carried authority, even in ruin. As the rancher turned his horse toward the open land, someone laughed nervously behind him. You're taking in trouble, they called. Maybe he was, because men like that, men no one claimed, were rarely what they seemed. They brought him in just before the light gave up for the day. The cabin sat low against the wind, timber walls creaking like tired bones, smoke leaking thin from a crooked stovepipe. Inside, the heat was uneven, too hot near the fire, bitter cold at the edges, but it was shelter, and out here that counted for something. The drifter didn't ask where he was. He didn't ask who they were. He accepted the tin cup of water with steady hands, drank slow, eyes never leaving the room. The host noticed at first the way the man looked without staring, measuring distances, door to table, window to hearth, the kind of awareness born from trouble, not hunger. Food was set down between them. Hard bread, beans thickened more by hope than meat. The drifter nodded once in thanks and ate without hurry, like a man who'd learned that rushing only invited mistakes. No name was offered. None was asked for. Silence settled in the gaps, heavy as dust. The host watched from the chair by the wall, every instinct split in two. One half said this was a mistake. A stranger with eyes like that didn't wander by accident. The other half, older, quieter, remembered what it meant to be left outside when the night came down hard. Mercy out here was a risk you took alone. You can stay till morning, the host said at last. Short, clean, a boundary, not an invitation. The drifter looked up then, just long enough to meet the words. He nodded again. That's enough, he said. His voice was calm, low, carrying a weight that didn't match the worn coat hanging off his shoulders. They settled into an uneasy rhythm. Fire popping, wind clawing at the shutters. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote cried and went unanswered. The drifter took the floor near the hearth, boots still on, back to the wall. Not fear, readiness. As the night deepened, the host realized something else. This man wasn't resting. He was listening, not for comfort, for change, as if danger had a sound, and he knew it well. Shelter had been given. Trust had not. Not yet. Morning came thin and gray, the kind that scraped across the land without warmth. The drifter took to work without being asked. He split wood clean and fast, hand sure, swing measured. Not the frantic labor of a man trying to earn his keep, but the calm efficiency of someone who'd commanded harder days than this. He fixed a sagging hinge with a glance, found a leak in the trough by listening to the ground, not the water. The host noticed, said nothing. They worked in parallel, the way frontier people do when words cost more than sweat. Chores became a language. The drifter stacked the wood facing east, against the wind. He salted meat with restraint, conserving without comment. When a fence post leaned, he braced it with stone instead of rope. Stronger, quieter. Small choices, telling ones. At dusk, by the fire, fragments slipped out. Not names. Never names. But places. A river crossed in flood. A ridge held against impossible odds. The drifter spoke of roads like they were teachers. Harsh ones. The road takes what you don't guard, he said once, eyes on the flames. And it leaves you with what you can carry. The host felt the weight of that sentence settle in their bones. The host's story came out sideways, the way truth often does. A loss mentioned without ceremony. A partner buried where the cottonwoods lean. The choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. Strangers don't scare me, the host said, not looking up. It's the ones who think they own the place. The drifter nodded. Too quick. Too knowing. Trouble came in small tests. A runaway steer panicked near the ravine. Dangerous. The drifter stepped in front of it, voice low, posture angled, hands open. He turned the animal with a breath and a look. Leadership, the kind that doesn't announce itself. Later, when a sudden squall slammed down, he read the sky and moved tools to high ground before the rain hit. No wasted motion. No explanation. At night, when the wind combed the grass, the drifter kept watch without being asked. He sat where the dark thinned, back to the fire, eyes on the approaches. He slept light, woke lighter. The host noticed the scars then, old ones, earned. Not barroom bravado. Field work. Decisions made when there were no good choices left. The mystery deepened in the margins. The drifter corrected a map with charcoal, lines precise. He recognized a brand burned into a passing horse and stiffened, just for a second. When talk turned to the local powers, his jaw set like a door bar. He carried himself like a man used to weight, responsibility, consequence, command, now choosing restraint. By the third evening, trust had a shape. Not comfort, not safety, something sturdier. The host realized the road hadn't broken this man. It had honed him. And whatever he'd been before, law, land, or legend, he'd walk far above the station and step down by choice. The fire crackled. Outside, the land listened. And the road, patient as ever, waited to take its due. Trouble always knew where to sniff for weakness. It rode in slow, confident, like it owned the ground before the hooves ever touched it. 3 men came down the road that afternoon, dust-coated, armed, smiling in that way that never reached the eyes. A deputy's badge caught the sun on one chest, though it hung crooked, like it had been earned cheap. The others wore the look of hired muscle, men who leaned on threat the way others leaned on fences. They didn't bother greeting anyone, just reined up outside the homestead and let silence do the talking. One spat in the dirt, another glanced toward the cabin, eyes lingering on the drifter with open contempt. "Didn't know you'd started collecting strays," the deputy said, voice oily. "That one looks like more trouble than he's worth." The drifter didn't move, didn't flinch. He stood a little apart, hands loose at his sides, gaze steady. To them, he was nothing, just another worn coat, another nobody passing through. And they treated him like it. The threats came easy after that. Taxes overdue. Land disputes suddenly remembered. Warnings about what happened to folks who interfered with county business. The men laughed as they spoke, enjoying the sound of their own authority. They expected fear, submission. Instead, they got silence. Then the drifter lifted his eyes. It wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic. Just a look, sharp, measuring, utterly unimpressed. He took one step forward, boots settling into the dirt like they belonged there. When he spoke, his voice was low and even, carrying just far enough. You're done here. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Something shifted. The deputy faltered, just for a breath, his grin tightening. One of the riders shifted in his saddle, hand drifting toward his rifle, then stopping, unsure why his confidence had slipped. The air felt different now, heavier, like a storm rolling in unseen. The host noticed it too. Not the words, but the way the men reacted to them. How authority bent, just slightly, around the drifter's presence. This wasn't defiance born of desperation. This was command, instinctive, practiced, undeniable. Drifters didn't do that. As the men finally rode off, muttering threats they no longer seemed certain of, the host watched the drifter in a new light. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just passing through. And trouble, it seemed, had recognized something the rest of the world had missed. The trouble hadn't returned yet, but it lingered. You could feel it in the way the wind carried sound farther than it should, in the way birds lifted suddenly from fence posts. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. The host didn't say much, but they began to move with purpose, checking the door hinges, counting cartridges, clearing brush from sight lines they'd ignored for years. Preparation on the frontier was never loud. It was methodical. It was born of memory. That was when the drifter stepped in, not asking permission, not boasting, just acting. He studied the land like an old map unfolding in his head. He pointed out a dry wash that could funnel riders straight into the yard, a low rise that would give a clean line of sight at dawn, an old corral post that could be reinforced into a barricade. His voice stayed calm, precise. Each suggestion carried weight, not urgency. It wasn't fear guiding him. It was experience. Weapons were checked next, rifles cleaned, ammunition sorted by hand, not by haste. The drifter handled each piece like an old acquaintance, testing balance, sight lines, the feel of recoil that never quite leaves a man's hands. He corrected grip without condescension, adjusted stance with a nod. The host noticed something then. This wasn't a man learning to defend himself. This was a man remembering. They moved together through the evening, one setting trip lines, the other sealing gaps in the cabin walls. No orders barked, no explanations needed. At one point, the host paused, watching the drifter sketch escape routes in the dirt with the butt of his knife. 3 options, each accounting for wind, cover, and timing. That was when it settled in. The mask hadn't slipped by accident. He'd chosen when to lower it. Night fell heavy. Watches were shared without discussion. One by the fire, one outside, eyes on the dark. Coffee passed between them. Silence, too. The kind that doesn't ask questions because it already knows the answers. Somewhere in that quiet, respect took root. Not gratitude, not obligation. Respect, because the host finally understood something important. The drifter hadn't stayed because he was trapped. He'd stayed because he was choosing to stand, choosing restraint over revelation, choosing this place and these people before the world forced his hand. And when the night deepened and the land went still, the alliance was already formed, quietly, deliberately, and without a single word wasted. They came at first light. Dust rose on the horizon in a hard, deliberate line. Too many riders, too close together, moving with purpose. This wasn't the lazy menace of drunks or the bluster of small-town bullies. This was organized, armed, intent, the kind of force that didn't come to talk. The homestead felt it before anyone spoke. Horses snorted in the corral. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of leather and steel. Somewhere inside the cabin, a floorboard creaked as the host reached for a rifle with hands that had shaken too many times already. Outside, the drifter stood still, watching the riders approach like a man studying whether he'd survived before. By the time the first shout rang out, "Come on out. We know you're in there." The land was already holding its breath. They surrounded the place in a wide half-circle, rifles raised, confidence thick in the air. The leader sat tall in his saddle, smiling like the outcome was already written. To him, this was simple arithmetic. Numbers, guns, fear. He glanced at the drifter and laughed. "See," he called to his men. "Just a nobody hiding behind someone else's dirt." The drifter didn't answer. He just stepped forward, slow and measured, placing himself between the rifles and the cabin door. The host opened their mouth to protest, but something in the drifter's posture stopped the words cold. This wasn't a shield made of desperation. This was a line drawn with certainty. The first shot cracked the morning open. It shattered a fence post inches from the drifter's shoulder, splinters flying. Chaos followed. Rifles barked. Horses screamed. The quiet land exploded into smoke and thunder. The drifter moved then, not scrambling, not panicking, but commanding space with every step. He barked orders that cut through gunfire like a blade. High ground now. 2 left, don't chase, hold. The host stared, stunned, as the drifter flowed through the fight like he'd rehearsed it 1,000 times. He reloaded without looking, fired without wasting motion, directed fire where it mattered, not where anger pointed. The attackers hesitated. Just a fraction. But in a fight like this, hesitation was blood. One rider went down. Then another. The leader's smile vanished, replaced by confusion, and something like recognition. He squinted through the smoke, staring hard at the drifter's face. "No," he muttered. "Louder now." "No damn way." The drifter stepped into the open, gun lowered but ready, voice calm enough to freeze the moment. "That's far enough." The leader laughed, sharp and nervous. "You think you scare me? You're still nobody." The drifter reached slowly into his coat, not for a weapon, but for a folded piece of leather worn smooth by years of use. He held it up, letting the sun catch the stamped seal. "You sure about that?" Silence spread faster than gun smoke. The leader's face drained of color. One by one, the men behind him lowered their rifles, whispers moving through them like wind through dry grass. A name passed from mouth to mouth, quiet at first, then undeniable. The drifter spoke it himself, clear and unflinching. "My name is known to every ledger you forged, every badge you bribed, every man you buried in shallow ground." He named himself, not loud, not proud, but final. A figure thought gone. A lawman whose disappearance had left a vacuum men like these rushed to fill. A ranch owner whose land had been carved up by cowards while they believed him dead. "I walked this land to see who'd rot in my absence," he continued. "You saved me the trouble." The leader tried to speak, tried to bargain, tried to threaten. None of it landed. The drifter raised his voice, just enough to carry. "Lay them down, all of you, or the law comes riding behind me, and this time, it won't stop at words." One by one, rifles hit the dirt. The siege ended not with another shot, but with the weight of a name heavy enough to crush everything built on lies. The land exhaled. Smoke drifted. The drifter stood tall in the open now, no longer hiding, no longer passing through. And in that moment, everyone understood the truth. They hadn't sheltered nobody. They had sheltered the storm. By the time the last shot echoed off the hills, the truth had nowhere left to hide. The men who came riding in loud and certain were gone now, some disarmed and bound, others fleeing back into the scrub with their confidence broken. The land fell quiet again, the kind of quiet that comes after violence has spent itself and found no more to take. The drifter stood in the open, coat torn, dust on his face, no longer pretending to be small. Names were spoken then, his name, and they carried weight. He had hidden because power makes enemies faster than kindness ever could, because the kind of authority he carried painted targets on the backs of anyone who stood too close. He had been running not from justice, but from what justice demanded of him. The host listened as the pieces finally settled into place. This was a reward that followed. No sack of coin tossed casually on the table. What came instead was protection. Papers signed. Boundaries redrawn. The kind of justice that doesn't make noise, but lasts. The threats that once circled the homestead lost their teeth. The land at last was theirs to keep. Morning came slow and pale. Light spilled over the horizon, washing the blood from the dust and turning the sky the color of clean water. Where boards had been splintered, rebuilding began. Where fear had lived, space opened up. The drifter, no longer passing through, helped set posts, mend walls, and stand watch as if he'd always belonged there. He didn't stay because he owed a debt. He stayed because some roads end where they're meant to. And as the sun climbed higher, the land breathed easier. changed not by who he was, but by who chose to see him when he was nothing at all. Out on the frontier, people learned to judge fast, by the dust on a coat, by the way a man walked into town, by whether he looked like someone worth noticing. And too often, those judgments decided who was helped and who was left behind. They thought he was just a drifter, another shadow passing through, someone easy to overlook, easy to dismiss. And because of that, they nearly missed the truth standing right in front of them. That power does not always announce itself, and worth does not always wear fine clothes. So let me ask you this, as the land stretches quiet before us, how often does strength walk past unnoticed? How many lives are written off because they don't fit the picture we expect? If you'd been there, would you have seen a nobody, or looked a second time? If this story made you pause, leave your thoughts below. Share what you saw in it. And if you want to keep riding these long frontier roads with us, through stories of justice, deception, mercy, and revelation, then subscribe and stay close. The wind moves gentle now across open ground. The man who was once ignored stands tall in the light, no longer hidden, no longer dismissed. Just proof that who we choose to see can change everything.